Okay, so we're gonna this week we're gonna talk about populism, which is kind of a new political ideal party system in America that comes out of falling agricultural prices and a growing dependency on rural areas. Um, Sharecropping in the South had basically moved everyone into the poverty level unless you were a large landowner, whether you were a freed slave, a poor white, no matter what. India, Egypt, and Brazil were growing cotton now, and that's one of the main reasons why cotton prices go down because Europe didn't need America anymore for their cotton. And in the West, many of the farmers who had mortgaged everything to get their farms after the Homestead Act, after property had been taken and you moved west and you were having to buy property from other people, so you needed to get mortgages, and farmers were becoming unable to pay back the banks. Um, they were also mad at high freight costs, loans, and many of the fiscal policies of the government at this time were not leaning towards bailing people out like we know it as today. And so, out of all of these things, populism comes to the forefront. So, the reason why it's called the People's Party is because it really aligned itself with the producing classes, which means farmers, ranchers, textile workers. Even in Idaho, miners. The Populist Party was very popular up here because miners produce things. Anybody of that nature, kind of what we would consider to be maybe the working class today, if you want to call it that. I don't necessarily like that idea, but that's the idea. It was really the last great political expression of the 19th century vision that America was a commonwealth of small producers whose freedom kind of rested on private property and the respect for the dignity of labor, meaning kind of what we had already talked about. If you work hard, you will make it in America. And that's kind of what this populist idea is all about. Okay, and when we say populist, that's what it means. It's kind of popular. It's what the people want to hear. There's a negative connotation for a lot of populist parties today because they're basically telling people what they want to hear, whether they can enact what they promise or not. But that's where we kind of get this idea. Um, like we talked about, small farmers were in bad shape by the end of the century, and so through the Farmers Alliance and the Party, they sought to remedy this, especially the cotton and the wheat belts of the South and the West, but also the industrial workers. So what they do is they meet in Omaha and they come up with this idea and the preamble, and part of the preamble and part of their whole idea is the idea that the nation has been brought to a verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Um, they brought up things like government control of currency, income tax, public ownership of railroads, things like this to help stimulate the economy. They said things like this will help stimulate the economy. It'll create jobs, and the more public works, the more jobs created, the better for everybody. Not just the poor, not just the working class, but everybody will benefit from this, uh, top to bottom. Um, the preamble is quite long. Um, their whole platform is quite long, but they do put it in writing, which is a very interesting thing. They say, here's what we want, and here's how we're going to try to do it. So their preamble talks about corruption in the ballot box. The newspapers are corrupt. The land has been concentrated in the hands of few, and that there is no law against that. There were no antitrust laws. This will come after kind of the Populist Party movement will create these antitrust, anti-monopoly laws. There's nothing against everybody one company or one person gaining as much control as possible. Um, and they say that leaves workers, industrial workers, farmers, ranchers, miners unprotected, and the fruits of our toil are going into the hands of a few. And this is where this whole idea of creating two classes in America comes from, this populist party. They say we are creating two classes, the so-called tramps and millionaires. They're saying what we would consider the middle class today, the Populist Party says there is no such thing, and there will be no such thing in America if we keep going on to do, if we keep going in the direction where our political parties are led by corporations, capitalist banks, monopolies, etc. They said we want a republic, which what the United States is, that all are equal. They said the Civil War is over. You can't do it. We're not fighting. This isn't something that you can do with violence, but with common defense of the general welfare. We can do this because we're all men and we all belong to the same brotherhood of men type of idea. Okay? So it's not necessarily violent like a lot of the strikes that had occurred, but they are saying we need social change. On their platform, we'll just go through a couple of them real quickly. Some ideas was their whole idea is a union of labor forces shall be permanent and perpetual. So basically, they're asking for unions to make sure that workers get a fair shake. Two, they want the wealth belong to those who create it, and if they don't, it is equivalent to robbery. That's a very Marxist idea in the sense that it came from Karl Marx. His whole idea was the wealth should belong to the people who make the products, not the middlemen, not the corporation, but the people who make the products, and that's the populist platform. They said the railroad should be public. It is how we travel. It's how the goods that we make move. It is how we get goods, and it's how this country gets moved around. And they saying when railroads are handled and owned by corrupt politicians and financiers, then of course they're going to be corrupt, and of course they're going to be making money, and of course they're going to be charging exorbitant amount of prices for goods. This is all just the platform. And the last one is kind of about finances. They wanted a graduated income tax. The United States did not have an income tax at this time. And they believed that the financial system should be in the hands of the people, equals as little as possible in the government hands. Railroads should be owned by the people. Telegraphs, postal system, all land held by the railroads or other entities like the railroads should be given to the people. So really, this obviously is counterintuitive to what a lot of Americans believe, even into today, what the American dream is, right? In a sense, they're talking about the American dream, meaning we work hard, we deserve to get paid well, and we deserve to, live off the fruits of our labor. But at the same time, they are also talking about things that today we would call maybe Marxist or socialist in the sense that they're asking for all of these private entities to be made public and to be owned by the public. And they're saying once this occurs, then the corruption and the high prices and everything else will stop. All right, so this slide we're going to talk kind of about the rollback of populism in the South and kind of a new racial order occurs after Reconstruction. We'll talk a little bit about immigration, and then we'll talk about women and their movements kind of post-Reconstruction period. The first thing we'll talk about are the Redeemers. And these were people who, in the South, especially politicians and landowners and people with power in the South, who were trying to redeem the region from the horrors of black rule, as they called it. Okay, that's their words, not mine. So what ends up happening is most of the police are white people, white men. Most of the politicians are, not all. Most of the town leaders are white. So what ends up happening is people begin getting arrested for not having jobs. And then what they would do is they would rent them out for labor on railroads or mines or lumber companies. And one of their mottos was, one dies, we'll just get another. Okay, so this is a kind of a complete rollback from what the North kind of wanted to happen in the South. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that Reconstruction just did not work, and people from the North weren't able to change the South like they had wanted to. Um, uh, but in some areas, life wasn't terrible for freed slaves, especially in South Carolina and Georgia, where there was a lot of rice. And we also talked about South Carolina was more African American than white, so in the they had power in the government as well. And in Georgia and South Carolina, there was rice, so they took up land that where the plantations had been. Um, and actually, in those two states, freed slaves owned quite a bit of land as compared to other places. But in the deep South, it was still an impoverished life, and freed slaves owned less land than during Reconstruction. The 20 to 30 years after Reconstruction, uh, their ownership of land kind of was rolled back. Um, some things like the Freedmen's Bureau did help in the sense that there were there were schools, there were a couple colleges, churches. So in some places there was a diverse culture, and there were people who were being educated. Some are even what we would consider middle class today. Um, but at the same time, freed slaves couldn't be supervisors or hold most white collar jobs. They were still working hard outside to gain what they could. So as this occurs in the 1880s and the 1890s, about 60,000, they think, moved to Kansas uh, and other places in the north, but a lot of them went to Kansas because that was kind of an uh, anti-slavery state. But even in the north, as they moved up there, northern employers were still more interested in hiring white immigrants than they were freed slaves from the south. So just because the north was fighting partly to free slaves, depending on who you asked, that didn't mean if freed slaves went up north that they would have any luck getting a job or anything of that much. Um, at the same time in the South, um, the South really clamped down on who could vote. From 1890 to 1906, every state in the South enacted some type of law meant to eliminate the voting of African Americans. And you kind of got to ask yourself, with the 15th Amendment that had just been passed, how is this possible? Um, it's it's pretty simple. They did things on paper that were racist. They did things that on paper did not look racist, but they were. For instance, they had poll taxes, which was a fee. You had to pay a fee to vote, which basically meant many freed slaves and poor whites too. This is not just freed slaves could not vote because they weren't allowed to. They didn't have the money to pay for vote. They had literacy tests. They had tests where you had to understand the Constitution, right? Like who understands a state's Constitution in 1875, 1885, when almost nobody could read. If you were a poor white or a freed slave, chances are you couldn't read, right? They had grandfather clauses that said, well, since your grandpa couldn't vote, that means you can't vote. But actually, the Supreme Court struck that one down of all the ones that but most of these were not. But like I said, this is not just freed slaves or African Americans that lost the vote. In Louisiana, 130,000. Louisiana had 130,000 black voters in 1894. They had 1,342 in 1904. So 129,000 people lost their vote in 10 years. But at the same time, 80,000 white voters lost their vote as well because they couldn't read or pay the fees to vote. So in the long run, by 1940, only 3% of black people in the South were registered to vote. So these things, it's not just 1890, 1900s. This had a very long-standing effect on the African American vote in the South. At the same time, Plessy versus Ferguson was passed by the Supreme Court 8-1, as you can see, in 1896. And this is one of the more famous acts in U.S. history, and it was a long step in kind of the United States ideal to not keep people equal. And this is the Plessy versus Ferguson was the Separate but Equal Facilities Act, right? Which basically meant if you had a bathroom, you had to have a white bathroom and a black bathroom, and the black people couldn't go in the white bathroom, and the white people couldn't go in the black bathroom. So the whole idea is that they're trying to keep races separate, but they're putting in but equal at the end of it to make sure that it doesn't sound racist, which it ends up being very much so. The only person who dissented, who didn't vote for it, was John Marshall Harlan, and he basically said he didn't vote for it because our Constitution is colorblind. He said the 13th and the 14th Amendment, which we had just discussed, made sure of that, and the whole idea is that no state shall pass a law which abridges the rights of its citizens, and freed slaves were citizens. He says this is unconstitutional. He says America is founded on choices, right? And if a white man and a black man choose to sit in the same railroad car, choose to go to the same restaurant, choose to go to the same movie, then they should be able to do so, although there weren't movies back then, but you get to go to the same public arena, then that's what America is, and that's what freedom is. Freedom is choice. And this, as long as it's not racist and as long as it doesn't hurt other people, that's what freedom is. That was his idea of what freedom was. At the same time, lynching started to grow again. It kind of went down a little bit by the mid-1870s, but once a lot of the northern pressure and northern people left the area, lynching went up again. Every year from 1883 to 1905, at least 50 people, mostly black men, were lynched a year, which is a lot when you think about it. And mostly, this is a generalization, but usually the charge was for raping white women. Obviously, this isn't an everyday occurrence, but a lot of times it was done politically or socially to gain some type of an advantage, right? This is terrorism 101, basically. So, for instance, somebody would raid a grocery store and a few men would get shot at. So what they would do is they would round up African Americans and they would shoot a few, and then the whites would take over the grocery store, meaning he took out his competitor's grocery store, right? The beginning raid was on an African American's grocery store, right? It may not have been it is racist in that sense, but in a lot of areas it was also to gain something politically or economically or socially. A white woman falls in love with the black man, right? And the dad isn't happy, or the guy who loves the white woman isn't happy, then there's a possibility that that man would be lynched. So it's not, well, it is race, but it's a lot of lynchings occur for some type of advantage or some type of purpose. Most of them were not just killing to kill, although some were, but in this sense. And these numbers are coming from Ida B. Wells, who's a well-known expert on this. She basically argues the whole idea of lynching is an excuse to get rid of Negroes who are acquiring wealth, right? Who have been freed slaves for a generation, who maybe they can read, maybe they went to a school built by the Freedmen Bureau, they understand business, they understand economics, they start a store, and they're acquiring wealth and property, and this is to keep, her words, not mine, keep the nigger down. All right, that's when I'm talking about lynching had a purpose besides just killing. That is her argument. But at the same time, she also says, isn't it the white men who's made generations of mulattoes who are mixed African American and white American, who who made a lot of these mulattoes through raping their slaves, right? So there's definitely a contradiction between not wanting your daughter to date an African American, even though there's a chance that at some point in your grandpa's life or your life, you had the opportunity to uh, rape a woman or a slave or force her into sexual relations with you, and you made a mulatto, but you're not in trouble for that. So this is Ida B. Wells's argument about lynching and just about how it was kind of it was a power thing, right? Not necessarily just killing for killing. At the same time, we'll just switch to immigration for a little bit. In the 1890s, 3.5 million people entered the U.S., but this was from all over. This was from China. This was from Eastern Europe, South America, Latin America. Not too many from Africa, but I mean, immigrants are coming from all over the world by the 1890s. And so what comes about is the Immigrant Restriction League. This is a league that forms in Boston in 1894, and what they called for was they wanted the government to reduce the amount of immigrants who could come into the country. And in 1897, Congress actually enacts a bill, but Grover Cleveland vetoes it. Okay, so this is kind of the first sign. I mean, there's always been grumbling about too many immigrants in America, but in 1895, this is the first sign that people are forming groups and saying, we want to control immigration somehow, and we believe that the government should do that. Okay, I mean, this is obviously still an argument that we make today, right? Or not that we make, but this is an argument that we're having still today in this country. How many immigrants should immigrants? How do you treat them when they come here? This and that. All of these things started coming to the forefront in 1895, 96, 97. The one immigrant nation that probably had it the worst and was getting it from both the governmental side and just the normal everyday person side were the Chinese. Both everybody's calling them odious, abominable, dangerous, revolting. What they really were brought in to do was to work the gold fields in California, the railroads and factories, and obviously they had no vote whatsoever. By the 1870s, whole families were coming in, and in 1882, Congress temporarily excluded them from coming in, but it wasn't until 1902 where it was made permanent. The Chinese immigrants were the first people in the history of the United States that a whole people were barred from coming into the country. And it started in the 1870s, but it was finalized in 1902. All in all, about 100,000 Chinese immigrants came from 1870 to 1900, and almost all of them were in the West. Like I said, gold mines, working the railroads. But they didn't have it any better than African Americans. They were blocked from schools, from jobs, etc. They weren't slaves because they were paid, but they were all doing menial labor activities. Lastly, real quickly, this is also when women's movements really start to come to the forefront. The 1890s is what some people call the women's era. So for three directions, from about the 1860s to the 1890s, things were moving in the right direction for women. They began, for instance, an example of this, even though they didn't have the vote, by 1900, 5 million worked for wages in the United States, which is a very large number. Things were going well for them. And these are women who did traditional jobs like secretarial work, factory work, things of that nature. but many of them were unmarried and many of them were college educated by 1900. No, I shouldn't say many, but some were as compared to before. So um, they were beginning to move up in society and beginning to get jobs that they couldn't have gotten 40 years ago. And a lot of this has to do with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, excuse me, that was made in 1874. By 1890, there were 150,000 women involved, and a lot of what temperance means, they're talking about uh, banning alcohol, stop drinking, because their whole argument was is when men drink, they squander their money and they beat their wives, right? Uh, so the whole idea of not, and it's a sin, but the whole idea is that they were looking for some type of economic and political reform and the right to vote. Okay, they're talking about how husbands and wives are peers in power and dignity. They're really talking about how everyone is equal in a marriage, things of that nature. Uh, and this is kind of when you start getting the idea of feminism movements, uh, kind of going towards the outlook of saying women should marry for love, and that that they kind of argue that even though we are women, and we kind of talked about this earlier, many freed slaves and African Americans have the vote, and yet we do not. So they're saying we're an educated members of society and are and of a superior race. So when we talk about the Women Christian Temperance Union, not to take anything away from them, because they did a lot of things, but at the same time, one of their main arguments is how come freed slaves have votes and we do not? We are superior to them. We are white. We are educated. They are not, yet they can vote. Okay, so that's an argument they make. They say immigrants and freed slaves were enfranchised in haste, and these people are ignorant, they're foreign, etc., etc. They say, how come we do not have the vote, and many people who perhaps can't read or write do? Okay, so that was one of their arguments. And so, unfortunately, many of these peaceful, kind of anti-drinking, kind of Christian ethics, help the poor. It was a social movement, keep things sanitary, trying to get food for a lot of people, setting up orphanages, trying to find kids homes. They're doing all of these good things in society, but the one thing that they don't do, or they do say, is that this movement's kind of mixed with nativism and racism at the same time. Okay, so that's kind of the social issues of the populism era, and we will talk about, lastly, the United States becoming a world power, and our PowerPoint will be finished. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about the United States kind of coming onto the scene of world power. Before the Civil War, and even quite a little bit afterwards, America was more of a regional power, carrying more what happened in the Western Hemisphere as opposed to the Eastern. They didn't necessarily care what was happening in Asia. They didn't necessarily care what was happening in Europe, but they were more interested in Latin America and South America. But a lot of that is going to change by the late 1800s. And it all kind of starts with this new imperialism of the 1870s. We won't get much into it, but Europe was basically colonizing the world by this time. And much of the justification for this was civilizing, in quotes, the backwards people of non-European descent. Okay, so this is when they really start hitting Africa hard, really start moving into South America. Really, they've already been in India, but then they start moving through China, Indonesia, the Philippines, places like that. At the same time, even though the United States were isolationists in the sense that they didn't care too much what was happening in Europe, the whole idea of America is about expansion, right? That's the feature of American life since the beginning, which was keep moving west, keep moving south, keep moving north from the East Coast, right? That's been kind of the whole manifest destiny. The whole idea of the Wild West and the frontier was to keep expanding. Um, and by the 1890s, people started understanding this in terms of the world, like saying, the United States is an imperial republic, and it's destined to start controlling influence on people outside of where we are now, and in fact to affect the future of the world. Um, and a lot of this comes from this yellow journalism the pictures that you see here. One guy's name was Henry Watterson. He was a newspaper man, and he starts talking about the lure of empire. Um, and he starts talking in his papers about the lure of empire, how missionaries were going out to prepare the world for the second coming and to uplift the poor and to bring light to the heathen worlds, right? Kind of the same thing as civilizing, Christianizing, so to speak. Um, that was his idea, but then there were a lot of people who argued the world's getting cut up into pieces, which it was, and many argued the United States needs to get a part of that because they're losing valuable natural resources by not doing this, right? There's gold in Africa, there's rubber, there's oil. In the South, there's South America, there's rubber, there's oil, there's all of these things that America needs to keep going, to keep moving forward. And a lot of people argued if we don't do it, the Europeans are going to. Okay. Um, and in 1890, a very, very influential book came out by Alfred T. Mahan. He was in the United States Navy, and the book was The Influence of Sea Power in History, and his whole argument was no nation could prosper without a large fleet of traders, and that no nation can prosper without your navy being stationed throughout the world. He says, look at the British Empire. The sun never sits on the British Empire. They're the most powerful empire on the planet, actually the biggest one in the history of the world, even into today. And he says the reason why they do that is because they had a navy, a strong navy, and they stationed them throughout the world. So right after this, President Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, very much influenced by this, and he starts a movement to capture Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Um, Hawaii had already been closely tied to the United States because most of the sugar companies and tariff sugar companies in Hawaii were owned by U.S. companies, and the tariffs were very small and cheap when you shipped from one place to the other. So it was kind of close to, it was kind of already economically tied to the United States. And in 1893, these sugar companies helped overthrow Queen, I don't know if I can say her name right, Liliuokalani. And although most Hawaiians did not want it, by 1898 it was annexed. I can't remember the exact date it becomes a state, but by 1898 it's basically a state. Um, and also in 1893 there was a small depression, economic depression that heightened many people's belief that the United States need to be more aggressive in their foreign policy area, and the reason for that is it'll stimulate the economy. Going out and getting oil, getting rubber, getting gold, getting timber, getting all these things from other places and bringing it back. Their argument was there's nothing there that can hurt the country, right? It can only make it stronger. There's also this kind of idea of a nationalism that comes through, and this is actually the late 1890s. This is when the Pledge of Allegiance was created, and the whole idea of standing for the anthem came about in 1897, 1898, and these mass circulated newspapers, we call it yellow journalism today, by Hearst and Pulitzer, especially on the right. It was actually named yellow journalism after Hearst's popular comic strip Puck, because it was kind of on yellow paper. And these guys are selling millions of copies of newspapers a day, mixing sensational accounts of crime and political corruption with kind of appeals to patriotic sentiment. Like you can see, the spirit of war pervades the breasts of all American. Patriotic citizens advocate recourse to, you can read it yourself. This is kind of what yellow journalism is, right? A call to arms, in a sense. And there were a lot of reasons for the Spanish-Cuban American War in 1898, but a lot of it did have to do with this yellow journalism and this really upsurge of patriotism in the United States and nationalism and this idea that we need to be on the world stage because we're missing out right now. We're losing, in fact. And so through the yellow journalism and congressional pressure, the splendid little war, which is what Roosevelt called it, began, and this is the Spanish-Cuban-American War of 1898. And this is really when the U.S., after this war, the U.S. really emerges as a world power. So what it was quickly, the Cubans were trying to throw off Spanish domination, and in 1895 they rebelled. Cuba was a Spanish colony, as were the Philippines, okay? So they were moving people into detention centers, these people who were rebelling against Spanish rule. And in fact, one of the detention centers was Guantanamo Bay, which the United States gets after this war, which obviously the United States still uses today. But in February 1898, there was an explosion on an American battleship Maine, M-A-I-N-E, like the state. It was probably accidental, but it happened in Havana Harbor, and nearly 270 people died. Excuse me. And these yellow journalists, Hearst and Pulitzer, had a field day, right? So then they start talking. They show pictures of cartoons of the boat sinking. If you're interested, look it up. There's a lot of funny things about, well, not funny, but it's just complete propaganda is all it is. It's National Enquirer-ish, except it's kind of telling the truth about things. So what ends up happening is the Americans back the Cubans for independence, and Spain rejects the Cuban demands for independence. So in April, 2 months after the Maine exploded, President McKinley asked for a declaration of war against the Spanish. The Americans wanted to help the Cubans kick the Spanish out of Cuba. And so what comes out of it is the Teller Amendment, which is basically created by Senator Teller, stating that the U.S. had no interest in annexing or taking over or bringing Cuba into the United States as another state, but all they wanted to do was to help the freedom fighters, in quotation marks, right? This is, some people call, we hear the word freedom fighters a lot today, whether it has a good connotation or a bad connotation, but that's what the Teller Amendment was about, helping freedom fighters in their struggle for liberty and freedom. So this is also something you can do your PowerPoint presentation on. We're not going to go through a whole bunch of the Spanish-American War. It was fairly short. It was only 4 months, and only 400 people died. 400 U.S. troops died. And actually, the most important fight against the Spanish were actually in the Philippine Islands rather than the Cuban islands. But you also, this is when Teddy Roosevelt becomes popular with his Rough Riders. Roosevelt went down there and he fought and he charged San Juan Hill, and he was very brave, and he's kind of adventurous, and this is kind of the war that made Teddy Roosevelt popular. He kind of already was, but this comes to the forefront, and the war kind of reinvigorates manhood and national unity, and this really propelled his rise to power. In fact, one of Teddy Roosevelt's favorite words was virile, Virile, which basically means manly, right? Going out and doing manly stuff, hunting, riding horses, that kind of thing. This is where Teddy Roosevelt really becomes popular, and this is also when America kind of becomes an empire. Um, with the help of Yellow Press, um, we went from the Teller Amendment, which was we're helping these freedom fighters kick out a foreign influence, even though we have direct, obviously Cuba's 50 miles from the United States border, so we have a direct uh, effect on who wins and who loses. But we went from this whole idea of kind of helping people with liberty to an imperial venture. And people get convinced that Cuba and then next the Philippines are really should be part of the United States in one way or another because we helped them kick the Spanish out. Now, in the Philippine War, um, at the beginning, many had welcome. So this is the second part of the war against Spain. The United States had kicked Spain out of Cuba. Now they were going to kick Spain out of the Philippines. And really, the Philippines are just a way station, right? This is Alfred T. Mahan saying, you need to station your navy around the world, and the Philippines was as good a place as other to get to China from America. So this is really the United States by 1889 or 1899 saying, we've already kicked him out of Cuba. Maybe we should just kick him out of the Philippines too. And so McKinley says, okay. And at first, many had welcomed the United States because the Spanish had behaved quite poorly in the Philippines. And many of the large planners look forward to having an American markets, and many people admired the idea of U.S. democracy, and many thought the U.S. would come in, kick the Spanish out, and they would lead the Philippines into this new era of democracy. But in essence, this is basically not what happened. It was kind of the other. The United States came in and kind of annexed it, and then they started behaving poorly, and they kind of started taking over plantations and government positions and telling the Filipinos what to do. One of the most famous Filipinos of all time, Emiliano Aguinaldo, um, had set up a government with a constitution based on the United States. But what happened after the United States got there and kind of started taking over from 1899 to 1903, he fought a guerrilla war against the United States military, and more than 100,000 Filipinos and 4,500 Americans died. And which is interesting because this may be one of the least remembered wars in the history of the United States, but over 4,000 Americans died and over 100,000 Filipinos died. It was a brutal 4-year guerrilla war against this Emiliano Aguinaldo, who welcomed the United States and welcomed democracy and thought, wow, you helped us kick out the Spanish. This is going to be fantastic. But in the end, the United States uh, the United States kind of did what Spain did and what every other European country was doing at the time. They were colonizing for natural resources, for people, kind of for their own good. At the same time, there was a lot of this yellow journalism of, in quotation marks, helping our little brown brothers, right? The Filipinos don't know it yet, but they need to be civilized, and we're the ones that who are going to do it. Okay, so this is part of becoming a world power. It's not pretty, but it's just what people did when they colonized, whether it was Germany, the Dutch, the Belgians. Even the Belgians behaved very poorly in Africa. In fact, they may have been the worst. Tiny neutral Belgian. The British. Everybody had this idea that colonization was all about civilizing. And so in America, a lot of people did not like this at all. A lot of congressmen, a lot of normal people, and this big debate on whether new lands of these people should be citizens or subjects came into play. This was an intense debate about democracy, race, and American citizenship, right? Because the American system of government had no provision for permanent colonies. Right? Isn't that kind of the whole reason why America fought the Revolutionary War? Because it didn't want to be a colony anymore, and there was nothing in the Constitution or in the rules of laws or in Congress or anything talking about colonies and what to do with colonies once you have them. What are you going to do with Cuba now that you have it? Are you just going to let them go back to what they were? Are you going to make everybody a citizen? The whole idea of America is every person has the right to self-government, right? And so you get a lot of things. This is when Puerto Ricans become an insular territory, so they're not citizens of the United States, but they're close to them. Filipinos are given the same thing, but at the same time, this we'll end with this just kind of this whole idea of colonizing is not something that the United States was based on, and so people have a hard time with it, and that's why a lot of people remain isolationist. And we'll talk about this. Many people didn't want to get into World War One. Many people didn't want to get into World War Two, right? Because as a republic of colonies who had been against foreign rule and foreign taxation without representation, right? They're saying that we don't have the right to go and do that to other people. Whether that's right or wrong, that's a whole different subject. But there were debates about this, and it was people just couldn't decide what to do. But to finish real quickly, at the dawn of the 20th century, the U.S. had showed signs that of kind of what it would become. It had already surpassed Britain, France, and Germany in industrial output. The political system was stable. I mean, everybody had their debates about what to do with colonies. The South was a bit of a mess, and there was a lot of discrepancy between Southern and Northern power and infrastructure and things of that nature. But if you on the world stage, it was very stable politically. Um, the white North and the South had reconciled in some instances, and some they hadn't, but they weren't as polarized. But at the same time, especially in the South, racial exclusion limited many freedoms for a vast majority of people that lived in this country, and not just African Americans, but any type of immigrant, and even a lot of white immigrants as well, right? This isn't just a dark skin, light skin type of thing. By the early 20th century, there was a lot of misgivings about immigration into the country. Um, and as we'll talk about a little more, at the same time, the idea of what to do with the empire, with freedoms, with liberty, what does all that mean, still had not been answered. So it's kind of by the turn of the 20th century, America was on the world stage, but they weren't the large world power that they will become after World War II.